And every chapter has a little, do I know this? And there's another little one there waiting for you. The planning and preparation phase is the most important phase of any pen testing engagement. Avoiding this critical step can land you in hot water with your client, with your boss, or even with legal problems. So, FYI, huge warning. Take this phase very seriously because it will save you from trouble down the line. First and foremost, we need to know our target audience, because in this we have to write a report that is our deliverable to the client or to the boss. Who is going to read the report that we create? What are the subjects, the business units, any other entity that will be assessed? And we'll dive into the report as we go through, but keep those general points in mind, that knowing who our audience is for this report, along with things like the entity or the individual's need for the report, the position of the individual who will read this, the main purpose and the goal of the pen testing engagement, the responsibilities of the person or the authority for them to make decisions based on our findings, who this report will be addressed to, and who will have access to it, all fall on understanding our target audience. Because the last thing you want to do is to have the chance to do a real pen test report, and you write this report and it falls on deaf ears because you wrote it for the wrong people, and they didn't understand, or they took it the wrong way, just giving you quite the problems. You don't want to do that in this very important document. Your rules of engagement, they specify the conditions under which the pen testing will occur. These are things you want to have written down. You want to document and agree on the rules with the entity who will be tested upon. This is just a little sample. You could also use something like a Gantt chart, like this, to help you break down everything that will happen in a timeline to document. With the big thing being, you want to have everything written down, when it's going to happen, who's going to happen to, any IP addresses, any security controls. You want to have all the things that are going to happen in the pen testing engagement written down before anything happens. Because again, if something goes south, you have the documentation to back you up. You also want to have good open lines of communication. In this documentation, you have to state who is the primary stakeholder when something goes wrong, because it might. You're doing a pen test. Things could go south during the test. So who gets the communication first? Who gets the communication second? Who do we need to interact with? You need to have that. You need to have that handy. You also need to have confidentiality of the findings. Again, who's going to have access to this information? Because this can be devastating, the things that we find. We're talking about possible ways that the organization or the people could get breached. That should not fall into the hands of like competitors or nation states or others who could use that for nefarious reasons. You also need to have budget. You need to have an idea of how much is the cost. What's the cost to running a pen test? You need to justify having a pen test. If you already have technical or non-technical controls in place, why should there be a pen test? Is it worth for you to do it yourself? And what is the return on investment for doing a pen test on an organization? I know, a pen testing class, and we're talking budget, but it's important because we need to pay bills. On your end, you have to account for everything that's going to happen in the pen test to not go over budget. How will you do pricing? And how do you clearly show return on investment for a penetration test? Answering questions like these will depend on how effective you are at creating your scope, at clearly communicating and understanding all of the elements of pen testing. There is also the point-in-time assessment. Is the company better or is it doing worse? A pen test alone will not be able to guarantee the company's security or the organization's security. There has to be ways to check remediation, to check impact analysis, to see on a timeline how the organization is either doing good or doing worse since the initial pen test. Now, I mentioned impact analysis and remediation. Looking at this, does this make sense to anyone? Just looking at all this, does it make absolute clear sense what we're talking about? So this is a common vulnerability scoring system. These are great for us in order to help explain exploitability metrics. It makes absolutely no sense to somebody outside of our field, right? It comes up in Nessus, but if I was to just give this to you without any prior knowledge, you might look at this and go, this is just a bunch of letters. If we showed this to anybody in the C-suite, they would really think this is just alphabet soup. But we can use stuff like this to make sense for them so they understand what the vulnerabilities are. So going down the line, so CVSS, again, is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. They're grouped in 3 major groups with a score of 0 to 10 assigned. The base group is the most important and mandatory for obtaining a score. Then you have the temporal group and environmental group. So our base, we have a base score of 3 out of 10. AV is not antivirus. AV is attack vector, the context in which a vulnerability can be exploited. So in this case, we could have an option of network, adjacent, local, or physical. So in this example, we have an attack vector over the network. AC stands for the attack complexity. Is this attack low or high? So you'll see either an L or an H. PR, privileges required. The level of privileges an attacker must have in order to exploit the vulnerability And this could be none, low, or in this case, high. UI stands for the user interaction. Is the user required to perform an attack? If it's N, it's none. If it's R, it's required. Lastly, the scope is the impact on systems being scored. Will it be unchanged, as it is here, or changed? It'll be a C. The next three, the C, I, and A, is the CIA triad. And all of them have their either low, medium, or high values. So in this case, this vulnerability has a high degree of impact to confidentiality, a low impact to integrity, and a low impact to availability. Now that I went through all these items, does this make more sense? And now that we went through it, could you better explain this to somebody who has no technical knowledge but has the power to fund, to implement a change? Because that's really what it comes down to, is can we explain it in plain English to somebody who controls the funding to allow us to make a change to reduce the vulnerability that we have just found? By using CVSS, we can get that information that we can turn into plain English to explain why this vulnerability needs to get patched over these others. So you could also have a temporal group, which contains exploit code maturity, remediation level, and report confidence. And then you can also have environmental group, which contains the security requirement and modified base metrics. Definitely useful as we write our reports. Now that it makes more sense. Disclaimers. You should have standard disclaimers in your report. Like, for example, this pen test was conducted on applications and systems that existed on this date. Or this report is intended to provide documentation that the client will determine the best way to remediate any vulnerabilities. The report can't and won't protect against personal or business loss as a result of the use of the applications or systems. And we provide no warranty, no representation, or legal certification concerning the apps or systems that will be tested. I suggest consulting with a lawyer to customize your contract as needed, because these reports will be a legal document. You could have some technical constraints. For example, SQL could get corrupted during a pen test. You might have the technical constraint of technology that's specific to the organization. For example, I used to help out a company that made custom headlights or headlamps for motorcycles, and they used a very specific computer to make the headlamps, and that thing ran on DOS. Your skill set can also be a technical constraint. If you are really good working with Windows, but then you go into a Mac shop, your skills may be limited. And anything that's out of scope could provide performance. Like if we're testing an internal website, but a switch is getting in the way, that might be out of scope and might affect. Again, something that you need to discuss with the stakeholders before you do the test. You also have a number of support resources from things like the Simple Object Access Protocol, Swagger, the Web Service Description Language, GraphQL. You have a number of tools at your disposal to help you as you prepare to write this report ahead of doing the pen test. Continuing with all the legal talk, because again, we are right on the border between legal and illegal, so we really have to pound this down before we get into the fun stuff. One of the most important documents in a pen test is the contract. It specifies the terms of agreement, how you're going to get paid, because clear documentation of the services performed. This document must be specific. It must be easy to understand without any ambiguities. I suggest getting legal advice. Your customer may have a legal department that will help review the contract. Either way, make sure that this very important document is totally legit and totally above board. Another important element of your contract is having written authorization. Do not go by just verbal authorization. Get it down on paper. Get some signatures down. You don't want to get into hot water because you didn't have the proper paperwork in line. So have a contract that spells everything out clearly and get those signatures before we get started. You also need a scope of work. The scope of work specifies the activities that are going to be performed, like the project timeline, the delivery schedules, the work performed, the location, any special or non-technical requirements, payment schedule, and any miscellaneous items that need to be listed and tracked. This needs to be there. You need a master service agreement. These can be used to quickly negotiate any work, especially if you're going to be working with a client continually. Having something like this is beneficial because you spell out everything that's going to happen. That way you don't need to renegotiate every single time you're going to perform work. We also need a non-disclosure agreement. Because again, the stuff that comes out of pen tests can be very damaging, and you don't want that information to go into the wrong hands. You need to write out an NDA that's either unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral. If you're dealing with international, note that there are some things that you need to deal with. For example, it is not okay to export any cryptographic software or encryption technologies to certain countries, because cryptographic software or encryption tech is considered an arm. And of course, any corporate policies should be taken into consideration before we get into the fun stuff. So that's the legal jargon as we move our way out into the scope of our pen test engagement. What we're going to do. So after we have our contract and all that written out and starting to get to the system, one of the big parts that you need to be aware of is your scope. You have to carefully identify and document all the systems, the applications, and any networks that you're going to test, along with any specific requirements to do the test. Because the broader the scope is, the more skills and requirements are going to be needed, which could mean a much longer test, which could mean more disruption. It could cause you more problems than not. So your first big enemy is scope creep. If you don't have your scope in check, it could grow and just cause mayhem left and right. Scope creep happens when there's poor change management, when there's ineffective identification of what's going to be required in the pen test, and poor communication. Not all scope creep is bad, but be aware of scope creep. Because you might start with, we need to do a pen test on our database server to ensure our database doesn't work. And then it just so happens that that database server is sitting in a Hyper-V instance that's connected to a Juniper switch that is port forwarding stuff out. And what started as just a database test turns out into a network test, turns out into an infrastructure test. And if you are not well skilled and well versed in these things, you might just get stuck in a hole. You need to identify the types of assessment. If it's a goal or objectives-based assessment, then you and your client agree on a specific goal or outcome that's the result of this test. Again, this is where you want to make the scope narrow and precise. The other type of assessment is a compliance-based. For example, maybe the organization needs to ensure that they are still within the regulations of something like PCI DSS or HIPAA. Again, special scoping requires skills that you need to be aware of, which is fine as long as you know what you're doing and not getting out of hand. So as you select your targets, be very careful and communicate with your stakeholders so that you're testing the right devices, the right infrastructure, and not just launching a scan on everything and let's see what happens. Your strategy can be broken down into 3 boxes. The black box, where you have absolutely no idea of anything and you have to start from scratch. This is the most realistic to a real attack. You have the white box, where you have the IP addresses, you have administrator credentials, you have a network map, you have all kinds of information already, and gray box, which is right in the middle. We also have risk management, which is really the crux of what we do. When we find these risks, the vulnerabilities, and we say, okay, here's how you can get breached, here's how your system could get overwhelmed, et cetera, what do we recommend? So a organization or the client could accept the risk that, yes, we know of this risk, but it'll work within our tolerance. We can handle it. It's all good. We can mitigate the risk, and usually it's through reduction, and that's implementing any countermeasures. Could share the risk. That's like in GLBA and HIPAA. Actually, those two prohibit sharing the risk, responsibility, or liability with others. You could transfer the risk to another entity. That is insurance. Avoidance, modify or cease the risk-causing activity, and monitor it. Again, the risk, the tolerance of risk for a client is a tactical decision and one that has to be evaluated. There is no cookie cutter way of defining this. This is going to be per every client that you have, but keep that in mind as you write out your documentation. In the compliance-based assessments, financial services have something important. And funny enough, it's not necessarily money, but it's customer and transactional information and financial assets. Keeping that customer information secured is necessary to establish trust between the community that they serve and them. So some regulations that you need to be aware of if you're doing compliance-based for finance is Title V of the Graham-Lee-Billy Act, or GLBA, the Federal Finance Institution Examination Council, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, the Safeguards Act of Financial Institution Letters, FILS. GLBA, for example, defines any financial institution as one in the business of which significantly engages in financial activities. So this applies to anything that's check cashing, payday lenders, non-bank lenders, technology vendors providing loans to their clients, any debt collectors, courier services, professional tax preparers, retailers that issue branded credit cards, ATM operators, credit reporting agencies. All these fall under the GLBA. They all need to make sure that they are GLBA compliant. The healthcare sector has the infamous HIPAA. There are 3 modifications to HIPAA that you should be aware of if you're working in health tech. The 2009 Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, or HITECH, the 2009 Breach Notification Rule, the 2013 modification to HIPAA privacy. There are a couple more guides that I provided in the lecture notes for you, so you can read this further. But all this falls under anybody who's a healthcare provider, like doctors, clinics, outpatient services, counseling, nursing homes, hospice services, pharmacies, medical diagnostic and image servicing, anybody who does health insurance, like HMOs, government health plans, any healthcare cleaning houses, and any business associates that could be legal, actuarial, accounting, consulting, and so on. Any of these people who access personal health information will fall under HIPAA, which is quite a lot. The third one that's compliance-based that you probably will run into is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. This protects any cardholders against misuse of their personal information and minimize payment card channel losses. The payment card brands can levy any fines against penalties for non-compliant organizations or revoke their authorization to use payment cards. They have a couple of their own terms that I provided in the lecture notes for you, like acquirer, ASV, merchant, PAN, payment brand, and so forth. In all three, you have a couple of key technical elements like data isolation, password management, and key management, like the cryptographic keys. When you do these kinds of tests, you'll have some limitations. For example, PCI will say you can only do things at a certain hour. You can only use so much bandwidth. There are some special testing requirements for legacy systems that are still in use. Any questions on chapter 2? I know that was kind of a lot. And not necessarily technical, but very, very important to what we do. Okay. Before I let you go, I want to share with you what you'll be doing this week. I have linked in Canvas The Art of War. The video is about an hour long. I suggest listening to it because a lot of the thinking that is there will apply to pen testing. The other item that you'll need to do is to create a draft of the documents that we talked about. Now, I mean draft because the documents that you create won't be legally binding at this time, but I do want you to start creating these documents because they'll help you down the line when you actually go and do a pen test. So spend some time this week looking at the documents that we talked about, the contract, the NDA, the scope of work, that kind of stuff, and create your own version of it. It's totally fine if you go online and you find a template and you make some edits to the template to suit your need. That is really what I'm looking towards, is that you have your own copy of these documents. So when you do start working in the field, you have something to work with and you're not starting at zero. Also, pick 2 of the laws or regulations that we covered. Any ones that you feel will be closer to the stuff you want to be doing. So if health IT was something that has sparked your interest, look into HIPAA. If anything in the finance, look at GLBA. Oh, anything with credit cards, PCI DSS. Take some time, look at the laws, any documentation on them, and write about how you would ensure that your clients meet regulation, meet the requirements that are set in those laws. That does not mean you need to write a 6-page essay on how you're going to do that. I'm not looking for that. But I want to help get your mind working, get your mind in that phase, in that place of, okay, if I'm going to deal with finance, then these are the things I need to put together. If I'm dealing with health, I need to know these things. I need to have these tools together. I need to set up Nessus in this way, for example, or I need to use Shodan to find X, Y, and Z, um, or use Nmap to detect this, that, or the other. Again, not looking for essays, but looking to put you in the mindset of, these are the first things I need to do before I start an actual pen test. Does that make sense? Cool. If you have any questions or if you're stuck anywhere, please feel free to use Discord to ask any questions. Feel free to collaborate on especially like on these draft documents. Feel free to work with others in the class. I mean, you have Discord and everybody in the class is on Discord, so feel free to chat in there or use the voice chat to work with others to get this done. I do not expect everyone's to be completely unique, and you know, you're not submitting this to Proctorio or anything like that. Like, this is helping you out in your career. So don't feel free to work together. If there are no other questions, I'll stop the recording.